The Lord be with you. One of my absolute favorite quotes from a movie comes from the movie Australia. Australia doesn't happen to be my favorite movie, but it contains one of my favorite quotes. And it comes from the narrator of the movie, who is a young boy, and it comes at the end of the movie. He says this: "The one thing I know is that why we tell story is the most important of all, because it keeps them people belonging always." Why we tell story is the most important of all, because it keeps them people belonging always. We have been traveling this year through the Gospel of Mark, which is full of stories of the life and death and resurrection of Christ. And these stories are stories that remind us that we belong. And as we've gone through them, they have been sometimes confusing, sometimes comforting, many times discomforting. Tonight, we're going to look at a story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, starting at verse 12. If you want to look in your pew Bible, it's on page 827. I invite you to take it out and open it up, because tonight's story is almost a story within a story. You see, we're going to look at the account where Jesus celebrates the Passover feast with his disciples. Now, Passover was a Jewish festival that recounted the story of God's freeing of the Israelites from the bondage of the Egyptians. It is, if you honestly have not ever taken time to read Exodus, do so. It is wild. There's a lot going on in that book. A lot of times I think Old Testament, wah, wah, boring. Exodus, not so at all. And this is a story that reminded the Israelites of who they were. They were enslaved. And it reminded them of who they now are, free people. And a key point in the Exodus came at the end, right before they fled Egypt under the leadership of Moses. It was the 10th plague, which was the killing of all firstborn of both animals and of humans. But God said to the Israelites on that night that they were to sacrifice a lamb and to put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. And as God went through, he would pass over the houses that had blood on the doorpost. Thus, the firstborn in that family would not be killed. So Passover was a time that they remembered God's faithfulness to them and their freedom. It was a time that reminded them of who they now were. It is a festival full of deep symbolism and tangible and tactile things to remind them of that. So tonight's story, though, we're not looking at Exodus. We are going to look in Mark. And in the spirit of one of my favorite radio shows, This American Life, tonight's story is going to come to us in 3 acts. Act 1 is the preparation, starting at verse 12. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, Jesus' disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent 2 of the disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city. A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room where my disciples and I can eat the Passover meal?' He'll then lead you and show you to a large room upstairs that is furnished. And there is where you shall make the preparations." So the disciples went and found everything just as he had told them. And they prepared the Passover meal. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Maybe if you have been here, you picked up some similar threads of this story. Maybe it stirred something in you of a reminder of a story that we heard where Jesus sent disciples into the city to get a donkey and to come back before the triumphal entry. It seems like this is something that Jesus knows, indicating that he knows what's going on, and he's got this under control. I've got a plan here. But I can't help but wonder if the disciples, as they're walking into the city, are wondering, man, is there really going to be somebody there with, this is crazy. Someone just with a water jar, and then we'll just follow them into this house, and it'll work out. And it does. And I think that helps bolster their faith. Or maybe the disciples at this point had more faith than I would, and they just knew that things were going to work out the way it did. So they went to prepare the Passover. Now, the celebration of Passover is about memory. Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has said this: history is something that happens to someone else. Memory is something that has happened to me. The Passover was a time to remember something that had happened to them, the Israelites. And the Passover was not simply a memorial, but it was something to be reenact, something to be lived into. And again, there is deep, deep symbolism in the things that they did and the way they celebrated it. One of the things is that they're eating this meal while reclined, because when you eat a meal reclined, you see that indicates that you are a free person, that you are not a slave, that you are leisurely able to eat this meal. The other piece of symbolism comes in a lot of the food that is prepared in this supper. Not necessarily the meal itself, but in what is called, what we call now, a Seder plate. So I've prepared tonight a Seder plate, and we took a picture of it so you can see it. I have a good friend who is Jewish, and she lent me her Seder plate for tonight. Now, each piece of this that is on this Seder plate has significance and connects to the story of the Passover. First, we have the parsley, which I will hold it up, but there's a picture up there, parsley. Now, the parsley symbolizes many things. The green symbolizes springtime. What happens in the meal, though, the parsley is dipped in salt water and then sprinkled. And it said that this is a reminder both of the sprinkling of the blood on the doorposts, but also the salt water is the reminder of tears and the mourning and the pain. We also have a shank bone. This was my favorite thing to gather. I am a vegetarian, and so I got to go try to find a bone somewhere. They sell them at Meijer, in case you're ever looking for one. This is a reminder of the 10th plague, and it would be a reminder of the sacrificed lamb and the bone of the lamb. Remember, the 10th plague being the one where all the firstborn were killed. And then we have a hard-boiled egg. Now, the egg symbolizes both life and fertility, but it also is a symbol of mourning, because hard-boiled eggs was a part of the meal of those who were in mourning. Then we have something called charoset, which is a combination of apples and walnuts and cinnamon and a little bit of red wine. And this is, people are like, oh, that sounds good. This is meant to symbolize the mortar that was used when they were making bricks and when they were enslaved. This is to symbolize that. Then we have bitter herbs. Horseradish is often used. True confession, the closest I could come was horseradish cream. So that's what we have here tonight. But the bitterness reminding us of the bitterness and the hardships of slavery. And then also there is a bitter vegetable, which not traditionally, but often romaine lettuce is used because the root of romaine lettuce is quite bitter. And again, that is a reminder of the harshness and the bitterness of slavery. Then we've got the matzah. Now, tonight we have actually flatbread. Traditional matzah is more cracker-like, but this is more just flatbread. Basically, it's bread without leaven in it. Leaven is what makes the bread rise. So this is bread without leaven, remembering that it is in haste that they fled from Pharaoh and his army, and they didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise. Also at the table were 4 cups that at various points throughout the meal, the cups would be filled and drunk. And the cups were reminders of promises that God had given them. If you go back later in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, you will see the promises that God has for the Israelites in there. And these cups represent each of those promises. So when the first cup was poured, it was the cup of deliverance. And God reminds them that I will bring you out of Egypt. The second cup was called the cup of freedom. It says, not only will I bring you out, but I will rid you of their bondage. The third cup is the cup of redemption. We're reminded of God's promise that He will redeem us. And then the fourth cup is a cup of praise, where we are reminded that God will call us by name and claim us to be His people. And often at the table, there was also a fifth cup. And that cup was not drunk by anybody, but that cup was reserved for the coming Messiah, awaiting the King. So, when it said that Jesus' disciples went to make preparations, this was likely part of their preparations, as this was part of the Passover meal. Now, as we said, there actually was a meal that was partaken of as well, and that happened between the third and the fourth cup. The entire Seder experience, Passover experience, is one of ritual. There's multiple hand washings and multiple blessings. There's always the retelling of the story of the fleeing from the Egyptians. And it's a reminder that they are still waiting for the coming Messiah. So, the preparations have been made, which leads us to Act 2 of our story tonight, the plot twist. Now, when it was evening, Jesus came with the 12. And when they had taken their places and they were eating, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be distressed, and they said one after another, "Surely not I." He said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to the one who betrays the Son of Man, for it would have been better had he not ever been born." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So can you imagine? Here the disciples are with Jesus at the Passover feast. Now we know that the disciples have been journeying, have been following Jesus along the way for a long time. And there have been many twists and turns, many ups and downs. So here they are in the middle of this feast, in the middle of the festival that brings comfort and reminds them of who they are, that they have been freed. That in the middle of that, Jesus drops on them, "I'm going to be betrayed. And not only that I'm going to be betrayed, but one of you are going to do it." You know, the disciples had maybe just come to wrap their minds around the fact that Jesus, who was claiming to be the Messiah, is indeed this king, the Messiah they were waiting for. And maybe, in fact, they're beginning to wrap their minds around the truth that this king was going to have to die to usher in a new kingdom. Maybe. But then to be told that one of them, someone from the inner circle, one of their friends, was going to be the one that betrayed him. We don't know, we do know, Mark accounts that they say one after the other, surely not I. Panic sets in. It can't be me, no way. We don't know if Jesus answers them or not. We don't know if he does answer them, what exactly he says. If he does tell them, no, not you, yes, you, no, not you. We don't know as the night goes on if the disciples continue to whisper among themselves or to point fingers or to place bets on who it might be or secretly wonder and fear that it might be them. We don't know what is going on in their minds, but I would imagine all of those things might be swirling in their minds. What we do know is that Jesus continued in the celebration of the Passover. We also know that as he continued, his words would become even more jarring, even more surprising. For he deviates from the script in a way that will forever change how his followers understand Passover. Which leads us to Act 3, the promise. Picking up in verse 22. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said, "This is the blood of my covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is the point of the story where it makes me think of, if any of you have ever read a story to a young child, a story that they have heard maybe 20 times in the past month, let's say. And let's say that night you're a little bit tired. And so you try to stick a couple of pages together as you turn the book to just go on. Or you try to shorten the paragraphs a little bit, speed things up. The child will not let you get away with it, but will astutely say, this is not how the story goes. And then, depending on how you're feeling, you'll maybe, either get creative and say, well, sometimes stories are told differently, or you'll submit to that and go back and retell the story the right way. This is a moment in the Passover meal where Jesus so far has been sticking to the script. And he does so, again, even as he takes the unleavened bread, because he takes the unleavened bread and it says that he breaks it. Well, there is nothing odd about this. This is something that is done in the Passover meal, but then he says something completely radical. And he says, "This is my body." Now, you remember we talked about how leaven was a symbol, unleavened bread, flat bread, was a symbol of the haste in which the Israelites fled from the Egyptians. It's also important to understand that leaven is also a symbol of sin. See, to make bread rise, what you would do is you would keep some of the old dough and put it in the new dough, and it would sour it, kind of makes more of a sourdough. And that would be what rises, what creates the leavening agent of the new bread. It would be impure. It would have some of the old in it. It wouldn't be new and unblemished. So when Jesus takes unleavened bread, which is unblemished, it is clean, it is pure, it is new, and says, "This is my body." The disciples would hear in that what Jesus is saying, I too am unblemished. I am fit for a sacrifice. For you see, it is only unblemished animals that God would accept as a sacrifice. So in saying, take, this is my body, Jesus is saying something quite profound and quite new. Then he takes the cup and he continues to rewrite the script of the Passover. Now, remember, there are 4 cups at the table. We have the cup of deliverance, the cup of freedom, the cup of redemption, and the cup of praise. And we talked about how these cups symbolize the promises that God made in Exodus. It's also important for us to understand that the cup is a symbol of God's wrath or God's judgment. In the Old Testament, we'll read things such as the cup of fury, the cup of horror, the cup of desolation, all of these things symbolizing the wrath and judgment of God. Interestingly, though, we also read that the cup is a symbol of salvation. For the psalmist says, I give praise for my cup of salvation. So the cup is a symbol of judgment and wrath, but also a symbol of blessing and redemption. So Jesus, when he takes this cup and says, this is the covenant of my blood, he is saying something quite profound. In a system where sacrifices depended on unblemished animals, Jesus has already indicated that he too is unblemished and fit for a sacrifice, and now is saying that this is a new covenant in my blood. This is a fulfillment of the covenant that God would bring you a king. I am that king. And this is a new promise that God's kingdom is coming and breaking in even now. One thing I know, that why we tell story is the most important of all, because it helps keep them people belonging always. So why is it that we faithfully come to this table? Do we come to be reminded of Jesus' sacrifice? Yes. Do we come to be reminded that we are part of a community of believers? Yes. Do we come to be reminded of the hope that awaits us at a future banquet table when Christ comes again? Yes. All these things are true. But mostly we come to be reminded that we belong in life and in death, in our body and our soul, to Jesus Christ. We come to be reminded that we have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer us who live, but it is Christ who lives in us. Have you ever stopped and thought about what an intimate act eating is? Now, I'm not talking about the intimacy that comes when you're with a good group of friends and great conversations and good food and drink and the perfect ambience. Yes, that creates a sense of intimacy. I'm talking about the actual act of eating. I mean, we take something, we ingest it, and it literally becomes a part of who we are. It nourishes us, it feeds us, it becomes part of us. That's quite an intimate act. At this table, we are given the gift of grace that is union with Christ. We are given this great promise that God has redeemed us, that Christ dwells with us and that Christ is coming back again. And we must gather to remind ourselves of this story because we are living in the precarious in-between. We have been redeemed, but Christ's kingdom has not yet fully come. It's the already, but the not yet. And if you're anything like me, there are moments in your life where you could use a little more already in your not yet. Your not yet consists of an addiction that you wonder if you'll ever be free from. Your not yet consists of deep mourning and deep pain from loss and from death. Your not yet contains deep-seated lies of your self-worth and who you are. And you long for more of this already in your not yet. And that is why we come to this table. If you remember last week, Trig preached on what he called the Jesus Code, that we all need a code to live by. And this code is to love God and to love our neighbors. And this is not an easy task. And it is not something that we can do on our own. We need nourishment. We need Christ in us to do that. So we come to this table week after week to be reminded that we belong. For this is Christ's table, and Christ is the one who invites us here. We need to be reminded that Christ is the source of this mysterious faith that we have. We need to be reminded that we don't simply partake in a memorial act, but we come to a table where we are nourished and we are fed. One thing I know, why we tell story is the most important of all, because it keeps them people belonging always.